Hi guys, Allison here. Welcome back to the channel. If you remember last week we talked about forgiving yourselves, and that was part one of two, and today's episode is on forgiving others. And I thought long and hard about how to approach this. There's a lot of aspects to forgiving others that aren't necessarily part of forgiving ourselves. And so I thought the best way to illustrate it would be to actually tell you the story of how I forgave my mother. Forgiving someone so close to you, such as a mother, a child, a sister, brother, best friend, that sort of thing, husband or wife, those are very difficult things to have forgiveness around sometimes. And I thought maybe if I illustrated kind of how I did this, the process of doing it, it would help you understand how to deal with forgiving others. Now, in general, before I get to that, when you're forgiving other people, it's actually best to start small. In other words, start with, maybe a friend of yours, maybe not your best friend, but a friend, someone you've known that you feel like has done you a wrong. And if you start small with someone like that, it's often a lot easier to, kind of get the idea of the process and then kind of work your way up to, the bigger fish, as we would say. So I encourage you to do that. But I'm going to discuss probably one of the most difficult people I had to forgive in my life, which was my mother. So my mother and I had, as most of you I'm sure have had with your mothers or, other family members, we had a complicated relationship. When I was young, I was very close to her. My father died when I was 10, and so I really, connected with her. We really bonded, and I look upon those teenage years that I had with my mom till I went off to college as actually some of the best of my life. I mean, I felt like, those were good times with her. And now I can look back and I can see there were already, cracks in the facade, as you would say. My mom was a troubled person. She had a horrific childhood. If you've ever read the books of Charles Dickens, of the horrible, orphan children back in the 1800s in England, my mother had a childhood that was about that traumatic. Her own mother died when she was young. She lived in poverty during the Depression. Her father was an abusive drunk. She was kind of farmed off to different relatives after her mother died. No one really gave her the love she needed or deserved, and she was scarred by it. And of course, I have appreciation for that now. For many years, I didn't even realize the extent of the damage that had been done to her psychologically. So my mom was damaged, and when she became a mom herself, she did try. And I know she, like I said, I have good memories of being with her when I was a teenager. She really did try to be there and be a good mom in the only way that she really knew how to do that. Fortunately, she had not really started heavily drinking at that time, and so that helped. Alcoholism ran in her family. And she did not start drinking young. She actually became like an alcoholic in her middle age years and beyond. So when I was growing up, I really didn't have to deal with that aspect of it with her. But there were warning signs along the way. For instance, when I went off to college, I was still 17 years old. So I wasn't even an adult yet. And my mother, her attitude was, when you're at college, of course, this was in the days before cell phones and all that stuff, and her attitude was, call me once a week, collect, and check in with me. But she said, don't tell me anything bad. I just want to know the good things that have happened to you. Now, that's a little strange for a mother to say to a child, but it didn't really hit me at the time. It only hit me years later that was a little odd. So there were little, tells like that along the way. My mom was really good at wearing a mask. And if any of you out there can identify with that, you've known people that do this in your life. She really was good at wearing a mask and kind of playing a part. She wasn't always authentic. She wasn't always real. And I didn't really, again, realize that until much later. So, anyway, fast forward to around the time I'm 30 years old. My mother was 60 at that time. And that's when things really started to go downhill. And so, for the 30 years of my adult life after that, until she died when I was 60 and she was 90, we had an increasingly troubled relationship. She started drinking heavily. She wasn't a mean drunk. She was what I call an indifferent drunk. She just didn't really care about anything or anyone when she was drinking. And so it became I basically started losing my mother by, inches after I was about 30 years old. And she started saying mean things to me or just not caring whatever was going on with me. And it was, considering I didn't have a father in my life, it was really hurtful and it really caused me a lot of pain. Well, by the time I was probably in my mid to late 40s, I realized that my mom was never going to change. I didn't even realize actually at the time how heavily she was drinking, because she lived alone and she lived up far away from where I was at the time, and so I didn't really see her that often. But she was really suffering. I mean, she was a really hardcore alcoholic by the time she was, I would say 70 years old. And it's amazing that the alcoholism didn't kill her, because she ended up having to stop drinking when she was about 83 years old, because she was living in an assisted living and they didn't allow alcohol and that's a whole other story. But anyway, the thing is, I was starting to realize that I had to forgive my mother. I had to forgive her for being damaged, for being flawed, for lashing out, not really knowing how to really be a mother as time went on. And the thought entered my mind, but it took a while for me to kind of implement that. And so what I started doing, and I knew several people, friends at the time, who would, I'd tell them about things my mom had said to me, and they'd go, "I don't even understand how you still speak to her." And I was like, well, she's my mother. And I realized that for me, it was very important for me never to turn my back on her. And in order to do that, I had to forgive her, because it was very difficult to even speak to her on the phone. I used to call her. She never called me. When I was younger and, in my 20s and in college, she would sometimes call me, like on my birthday or something like that. But she never called me. I was the one that always had to call her. And I just realized that I had to forgive her, not for her, but for me. And the reason I had to do that is so that I could start treating her with kindness, even in the face of her indifference or cruelty or whatever else she was going to throw at me. Because I wanted to feel good about me. I knew that someday she was going to die, and I didn't want to feel guilty that I had not been kind or decent to her, because she's my mother. And I might not have felt that way towards someone who was a friend or something, but I definitely felt like that towards my mother. So I worked on it, piece by piece, month by month. And basically what I first started doing is I called her when I knew she wouldn't be drinking, because it was easier to have a conversation with her. I never told my mother that I forgave her, because she never brought it up. Which brings up another important aspect of this. If someone comes to you and asks for forgiveness, then it's up to you to decide whether you can forgive them or not. And that kind of puts them on the line, because you possibly might not forgive them. But my mother never asked for forgiveness. She never asked me to forgive her. In fact, I doubt she even thought she had anything to be forgiven for. So I never told her I forgave her. Because what would have been the point of that? That would have actually sounded like I was talking down to her or being patronizing in some way. So I never told her, but my actions told her, because I started treating her differently. As kind of the pain eased away from my own heart in dealing with her, I basically started being nicer to her. I started learning how to deal with her. And so on the phone, when she said something mean or something, I would tell her, I said, well, maybe we should talk another time, or, let's talk about X, Y, and Z, or we'll talk about something different. And that often worked. So I never had to get mad at her or yell at her or anything like that. I basically just, my rules of the thing were that I was going to be kind to her as much as possible, but I also wasn't going to take any abuse. Because forgiveness does not mean forgetting. Just because you forgive someone doesn't mean you keep allowing them to be mean to you or abuse you in any way. So it was very important for me to maintain my own sense of self through that. And it wasn't easy at times. I mean, there were times I got off the phone with my mother and I just started crying because I felt like I'd lost her years before she actually died. Now, was I all done forgiving her before she died? No. I'd say I was about 2/3 of the way there. It wasn't complete forgiveness at that point. But right before she died, she and I had, I was able to talk to her on the phone, and I could feel the gentleness of her soul. I could feel the kindness in her that I hadn't seen for many years. And it made it much easier to forgive her after she died. I wasn't with her physically when she died because she was 1,500 miles away, but I did speak to her on the phone 12 hours before she died, and I got to say to her what I needed to say and also ask her the questions I needed to ask, which was that I said to her that I loved her very much, which was the truth. And I was crying during that. And then I also got to ask her, I wanted to make sure she was okay with the fact that she was dying. My mother had lived for, most of her life being afraid of death, and she couldn't even talk about it and all that. But she did come to an acceptance of it. And I was able to hear that in her voice. So, and she was able to say that she loved me too. And that's all that needed to be said. That's all that needed to be said. So it worked out and it was fine. And so after she died, I went through grief, just as you do. Even if you're prepared for someone's death, you can still go through grief. And as part of that grieving process, I was actually able to do the rest of my forgiveness of her. And to me, that was kind of a lesson in why it was so important to forgive. Even if it had to happen in stages. It didn't happen overnight. I had to work on it for several years. But it was complete because when she died, I didn't feel guilty. I knew that I had done everything I could to maintain a relationship with her and yet not be abused, and to forgive her as much as I was able to do. And that's all we can really hope for, isn't it? I think we can only hope to forgive as much as we're able to do. And sometimes it's not 100%. Sometimes we can forgive 50% or 75%, and that's okay. So I've given you this example, this little story today, so that you understand that even with somebody that is so close to you in your life, a parent, a child, a spouse, a sister or brother, it is possible to forgive. But it's not about them, it's about you. It's about you. It's always about you. And because the forgiveness is what helps you. Now, again, it's a little different if somebody comes to you and asks for forgiveness. That's a whole other scenario. But in the scenario that I'm talking about, where the person's not coming to you for forgiveness, but you need to forgive them in order to be at peace yourself, you're doing it for you. You're doing it for your own peace of mind. You're doing it to have integrity with yourself. And that's what's most important. So I hope this has been helpful for you today. And if you have a journey of forgiveness that you need to do, please treat yourself gently along the way and just proceed step by step. So until next time, be well, keep moving forward, work on the forgiveness. Take care.